Para comenzar, quería referirme a quién es, creo que esto lo va a aclarar Mark, quién es Joseph Beuys. Sabemos que es un personaje de culto, fascinante, extravagante, que fue visto como un superstar, una superestrella, un alquimista, un chamán, un charlatán, un embaucador. No caben dudas precisamente que el profundo, muy profundo análisis que hace Mark Rosenthal en ese texto tan realmente recomendable para leer, que está en el catálogo de esta muestra, va a contribuir a una justa apreciación de este artista alemán. Entonces, la primera pregunta va a ser, ¿cuándo comienza a verse, digamos, a Joseph Beuys en la justa dimensión de artista, más allá de esos calificativos que muchas veces nos desvían de lo que es Joseph Beuys? Entonces, ¿cuándo, cómo y dónde comienza a reverse la importancia de Joseph Beuys para el arte del siglo XX?
Joseph Beuys began making art in the early 50s, but really starting in the late 1950s and then into the 1960s, he started to have a tremendous impact in Germany, mostly through his performance works, which were called actions. Now, for much of the 60s and a good part of the 1970s, he was an artist who, as Elena said, was a kind of cult figure that belonged to Germany. But starting, and very few Americans knew much about his work, although there were some who did. And he came to the United States famously in 1974 to do a performance, very famous performance. But very few people, even in Europe, knew that much about Beuys. But then, starting in the mid-1970s, he started to be shown a little bit in Europe and France, later 70s in England. And then in 1979, he had an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum, which became a kind of watershed moment, because it was the first retrospective he had ever had, and he had organized it himself. It was the first time the Guggenheim Museum had ever been devoted to one artist, and he had barely been shown in America. And so this exhibition attracted enormous, enormous attention. But something else preceded this, and what preceded it was that through the 70s, building really to a crescendo toward the end of the 70s, German artists started to be better and better known. And I'm speaking of a group of artists, Baselitz, Georg Baselitz, Anselm Kiefer, Gerhard Richter, and Sigmar Polke. They're all painters, and they started to be celebrated, not just in the United States, but across Europe. And this group of artists became a kind of alternative reality to what was being projected as the mainstream of art in America. Well, as people started studying Kiefer and Polke and Richter, inevitably people discovered that the father figure to all these artists was none other than Joseph Beuys. And so that's when the attention started to build on Joseph Beuys, and then it culminated with this Guggenheim show. And after that, all through the 80s, more and more attention came. So what I'm explaining in answer to the question, when did he start to be considered important for the 20th century, is what is known as critical fortunes. In other words, when does an artist become recognized, become seen by the world? And that's how it happened. And in fact, it was late in Beuys's life because he was to die in 1986.
Uh-huh. En relación a esto de este empuje que dan estos artistas como Gerard Richter, Polk, etcétera, para el reconocimiento de Joseph Beuys, la pregunta que quería hacer ahora es si, sintetizando, podemos decir que Joseph Beuys es un artista típicamente alemán que influye en este grupo de artistas alemanes, a pesar de que vamos a encontrar que las técnicas son diferentes, porque la mayoría son pintores. Pero, de todas formas, podemos decir que Beuys, para entender a Beuys, tenemos que pensar que es un artista alemán o directamente internacional. Obviamente que ocupa un lugar en el circuito del arte internacional, obviamente. Pero en cuanto a las raíces conceptuales que nutren la obra de Beuys, ¿lo consideramos un artista alemán? Alemania ha tenido, digamos, importancia trascendental en el surgimiento de su obra.
Well, I think to some extent it's a question that remains to be answered by subsequent generations. Here's how I feel about it. I have become enamored with the idea that this group of German artists, Beuys, Baselitz, Kiefer, Polka, and Richter, aren't simply a group of provincial artists best understood in Germany. To my mind, they represent an extremely significant wave, really the equal to something like abstract expressionism in the United States. So, abstract expressionism in the United States consists of artists like de Kooning, Pollock, Rothko. Would one say that they are peculiarly American or only important in America? Well, yes and no. They were Americans, but if that group of artists, if that type of art wound up having a broader impact, then one says, sure, they were American artists, but they wound up having an international impact. My thesis is that that group of German artists together, starting in 1960 and really running at least until 1990, represents an extremely accomplished, profound moment in art history. And I can talk a little bit about the context. The context is fascinating because, of course, it's the time of the two Germanys. It's a time of incredibly complicated, difficult emotions, political realities, so forth. And in that context, these artists created art, created work that relates to that context. But coming back to the group of artists, so my belief is that each of those artists has and has already demonstrated a great impact on artists, at least throughout Europe, if not the world. And if Beuys is the figure that broke it open, then Beuys belongs to history. Beuys belongs to a period, almost half a century of art made in Europe that had this, that represented an alternative universe to what America was projecting as its importance in the world. So everybody, every one of us, we're all ciphers of our nationality, but do we become world citizens, as it were? Can we affect our fields and so forth, even as we continue to be Argentinian or American or whatever? Of course, of course. And I think that about Beuys. But I do feel that often when we talk about what is euphemistically known as contemporary art, we're leaping to conclusions. We won't be around when the grand histories are written of the 20th and 21st century. So we only can conjecture.
Yo recordaba, Mark, que ayer en la visita hablabas de la herida, de Alemania, ¿no? El tema de la herida está muy presente en la obra de Joseph Beuys, la herida y la posibilidad de la cura. En ese sentido, ¿no? Estaba pensando esa herida que se sentía, digamos, en términos de la división que estaba en ese momento en Alemania, ¿no? Del este y del oeste. Esa herida, digamos, ese corte, no tendría que ver también con el tema de la herida en la obra y la posibilidad de una cura, que tendría que ver, me parece, también con ese símbolo de la cruz, que más allá de la cruz cristiana es una cruz que tiene las partes iguales, hablando de la posibilidad de unir y de igualar. No sé, en ese sentido, la herida alemana sentida por Beuys y otros coterráneos, sí sería una motivación.
Well, Beuys often showed crosses that were split in half, or he showed half crosses. And in a number of his performances, which he called actions, he would try and stitch them together, find ways to heal the cross that had been divided. And so the cross did become his symbol for a wound. There were other symbols for wounds. But also there was the whole question of division and an entity that had been divided, such as Germany. But it wasn't only Germany. He had a concept that's really describing a history. He would talk about Eurasia. And what he was talking about was the continent of Europe and Asia as one giant place that once upon a time existed, which subsequently was divided politically. And he wanted to bring back unity, synthesis. And he wanted to bring back this synthesis, but he also turned it into a kind of physical and emotional concept. He was obsessed by the subject of wounds. His own wound, the wound of Germany by being divided, the wound of humanity by being divided between men and women, the wound that described the division or the double between humans and animals. He was constantly obsessed by this, and when you look at his work, if you just carry that one thing, that one idea of the double or the two halves that need to be brought together, you see it constantly in his work. So the wound is arguably his chief subject, and he, as a shaman, which is how he saw himself, was concerned to heal the wound.
Hay un hecho casi cinematográfico o muy teatral, digamos, que es lo que él cuenta, Beuys, acerca de que él, yendo en un avión en la época de la guerra, él formó parte de la aviación alemana y fue cuestionado también por esa participación dentro del nazismo. Este avión cae, es derribado y cae en Crimea. Cae en Crimea y él cae en la nieve, el compañero se mata porque tenía el cinturón puesto, mientras que él es eyectado del avión y cae en la nieve, se salva, y él cuenta que vienen los tártaros y un pueblo nómade, lo curan, le ponen justamente estos materiales que él va a usar mucho, la grasa, lo envuelven con grasa, con fieltro, como para darle calor, y lo alimentan con miel. Este relato crimeo en realidad tiene parte de real, él realmente iba en el avión que fue derribado, y parte imaginaria, ¿no? Lo cual contribuye a hacer de Beuys un personaje un poco sospechoso también, hoy decíamos embaucador, ¿no? Entonces, porque bueno, justamente Mark en su texto nos hace ver que esa parte es imaginaria. Pero ¿en qué medida ese relato que él imagina nos sirve de metáfora del arte, de la posibilidad del arte de curar la herida? Y en ese sentido recuerdo lo que decía Nietzsche, que el arte cura. Y Deleuze después va a decir que en realidad a lo mejor algún día se descubre que no hubo arte, solo medicina. Ese relato crimeo, entonces, podríamos considerarlo una metáfora del arte que cura, y su cuerpo sería también como parte de esa metáfora, él mismo curado, la posibilidad de ser curado a través de la obra. ¿En qué medida esto influye, no?
Well, throughout Beuys's career, he told this story. And of course, the story is wonderfully colorful, that this group of nomads found him in the desert, wrapped him in fat and felt, and saved his life. And every time he had an exhibition and something was written about him, the story was told again. And it was told again, and again, and again. And this became his story. It wasn't true. And only toward the end of his life did it come out that it wasn't true. He never acknowledged it. People started writing that it wasn't true, and he didn't deny it. So that, of course, leads to lots of different questions and issues. First of all, there's the question, you mean you can't trust an artist to tell the truth? This was very upsetting to a lot of people, because a lot of people think that artists are truth tellers, truth sayers. What Beuys was practicing by doing this, though, he was doing a number of things by inventing this story. Number one, he was inventing what's known as a myth of creation. For instance, are all the stories told about Christ true? Is there that much evidence for all these stories to be told? It doesn't matter. It's a body of stories by which moral lessons are taught. All kinds of things are taught based on the story of Christ. Beuys was very conscious of this sort of pattern of the myth of creation, because not only is it colorful, not only did it attract attention to him, but it then allowed him to embark on the next thing. The next thing was, and here I only can speculate, that he must have felt guilt. He was a Nazi. He was in the Nazi Air Force. he must have felt guilt. And even if he didn't feel guilt, he then proceeded to make a body of work about Germany's guilt and the sins that Germany had done. And so the myth of creation functioned for him as a way to enact a process of healing, to deal with the wound, to deal with the guilt. But Elena mentioned the word theatrical, and theatrical is Beuys's middle name. These performances are nothing if not theatrical. To sit in the middle of a room covered with gold on his head, holding and cradling a dead hare, talking to it. If that isn't theater. So his whole enterprise as an individual, as an artist and as an individual in the world was theater and theatrical. I was just mentioning to Elena that I half remember a quote, and I'm not sure who said it. I think it was a Picasso quote. It goes something like, "Art is a lie by which to tell the truth." Beuys subscribed to this, subscribed to it totally. And art is theater. Art is absolutely theater. But it was kind of amazing when the truth came out how so many people were angry. They were angry at him. They felt betrayed. And maybe it was justifiable or maybe it wasn't. There's this concept called the trickster, and we can talk about that later. But it wasn't true.
Bueno, existe un ideal de que todo hombre es un artista y también el otro ideal de que el arte puede ser para todos. Paradójicamente, la obra de Beuys es muy hermética y yo creo que el hecho de que aquí venga tanta gente los días martes y los sábados a escuchar, no solamente a ver la obra, sino a escuchar al especialista, es porque hay una necesidad de entender algo que no es, digamos, claramente captado o directamente captado. Entonces, existe una paradoja o aún más una contradicción entre este ideal de Beuys de un arte para todos y del hermetismo de una obra que está llena de metáforas y de símbolos, que es el caso de la cruz dividida en partes iguales, es el caso del triángulo, es el caso de los materiales, que hay que saber por qué esos tres materiales, digamos, son tan usados. Entonces, la pregunta sería, ¿podríamos decir que Beuys no se pone, es un poco rudo lo que digo, que no se pone de acuerdo consigo mismo o que por un lado está ese ideal y que después él en la obra no lo cumple?
Well, I'm not sure if for him to contradict himself would be normal, given the story of Crimea. Here's what I would argue about that. I think all art has initially some kind of visceral or intuitive or visual, intellectual appeal or appealing levels to it, to an art object. Any art object has that to a greater or lesser extent. But can you learn more? If you read about the artist, if you read about the artwork, if you read about the period in which the artwork was made, of course. And so I would say that there isn't a contradiction because so much of his work is so unhermetic, really. I mean, there is a lot that is hermetic and opaque, let's say, but so much of it is emotional and visual and rich. So I would say it's like any art. There's always more to learn. And I always like to say, well, for instance, the other day, my wife and I were in Cologne, and it was a beautiful night, and the sun was setting, and the moon was coming up at the same time, and it was full moon, and it was such a glorious sight. Do I know anything about atmospheric science? That's a rhetorical question. Can I learn more? Of course. Can I learn much more? Can I learn more about the shade of white that the moon was that night versus other nights? There's lots more for me to learn that I don't know about everything. So I think that's true of art, but I think artists in general make art not for specialists. They make art for the public. Artists want the public interested in their work. Artists want to be seen in museums, most of all. Are there lots of things to be learned about the work? Of course. I don't think Beuys is being inconsistent. When he says everyone is an artist, that's a different sort of philosophical position. And that's part of his political ideas, one could say. That's part of his notions about democracy.